Welcome to Unit 8, Lesson 2, The Reform Movement, the Second Great Awakening, and Educating and Advocating. Being part of a large gathering can be exciting and inspiring. In the mid-1800s, some religious events were so popular that they drew huge crowds, much like a music festival or sporting event does today. A return to the church. The Enlightenment was a period in American history when political philosophers applied reason and logic to religion and society. New concepts about equality and government sparked the American Revolution. At the same time, scientific knowledge was expanding. The rush of new ideas caused many people to become skeptical of the power churches seemed to hold. Influenced by the Enlightenment, some people established new religions, such as Unitarianism, that combined the practical ideas of the Enlightenment with the teachings of the Bible. In the 1790s, some Christians re-examined their religious practices. Many began to believe they should have a direct and emotional relationship with God. This movement is called the Second Great Awakening. To revive or reawaken religious enthusiasm, many Methodists and Baptists, among other denominations, organized revival meetings, or informal religious events held outdoors or in tents. Revivals became very popular because they drew people out of church buildings and into nature. Some preachers drew thousands of spectators. Audience members cried, shook, or rolled on the ground as preachers delivered sermons. Often preachers evangelized or spread the Christian gospel by delivering dramatic sermons and sharing personal experiences. Many new believers joined Methodist and Baptist congregations as a result of the revivals. At these events, people felt a sense of freedom in worshiping with their friends and neighbors outside the formal organization of the church. Reforming social problems. One of the most prominent figures of the Second Great Awakening was a former lawyer and religious skeptic, or person who questioned something others believed to be true, named Charles Grandison Finney. Finney became a fervent, or eager, Christian and preacher after his law studies led him to read and examine the Bible. He used his experience in arguing court cases to persuade others to adopt his beliefs. Finney was passionate about social reform as he was about his faith. He believed a just society had the responsibility to improve the lives of all of its members. He delivered lively sermons calling for the end of slavery, the improvement of education for all citizens, and women's rights. Many other revivalist preachers shared Finney's views. As a result, religious groups actively promoted social reform causes. The temperance movement was one part of this social reform effort. The word temperance means moderation or self-restraint. The proponents crusaded against the overuse of alcohol, which had become an integral part of daily life. On balance, 19th century Americans consumed a lot of alcohol. In 1830, the average American drank 7 gallons of alcohol per year, 3 times the average amount consumed today. Farmers earned extra money by making whiskey with leftover crops. Local economies relied on alcohol sales, and drinking during work hours was a commonplace. However, both public drunkenness and alcoholism had become significant social problems. Temperance reformers approached the issue from different angles. Some wanted to curb the use of alcohol because they feared drunkenness was a threat to social order and economic prosperity. Others, motivated by the fervor of the Second Great Awakening, saw drinking as a sin. Some reformers wanted to protect women and children from neglect and mistreatment resulting from their husbands' and fathers' abuse of alcohol. Finally, medical professionals wanted Americans to limit their alcohol use for health reasons. The reformers also looked beyond alcohol-related issues. They called attention to poor living conditions in overcrowded cities and advocated for working children's rights in factories and mills. Many, including California pioneer Annie Bidwell, also promoted free public education and voting rights for women. Let's take a look at the picture on the screen. In 1839, J. Mays Burbank captured the fervor of a revival in his painting, Religious Camp Meeting. Revival meetings were also known as camp meetings. Most were located on the frontier where churches had yet to be built. Educating and advocating. When you see a situation that seems unjust, you want to do something about it. Likewise, positive changes in society have often started with one brave person raising his or her voice. Education for all. If you were female, African American, or an immigrant, it was hard to get a good education in the United States during the early 19th century. To address the lack of education for girls and women, a number of women established schools for them, including Emma Willard, who founded the Troy Female Seminary in 1821, and Mary Lyon, who founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1837. Schools and colleges for girls and women were a step forward, but women's literacy rates were still half those of men. Further, most young people who attended school, whether male or female, came from wealthy families. Many lower-income working-class and immigrant children could not afford a formal education. They chose work over school to help support their families. African American children faced other obstacles in education as well. Laws barred enslaved African Americans from studying at all, and free African Americans could only attend certain schools. Prudence Crandall, an educator from Connecticut, took a bold step to address racism in education when she opened the Canterbury School for Young African American Girls in 1831. Her small Connecticut town became the center of controversy. Crandall was arrested several times for unlicensed instruction. The school's water well was poisoned, and townspeople threw eggs and stones at her students. Crandall's school closed in 1834 after a violent mob broke windows and ransacked the classrooms. Clearly, racism against African Americans was not confined to the South. Individuals and groups worked to correct these injustices and reform the education system as a whole. The clear solution was to offer every American child a public education. Religious and women's groups campaigned for a public investment in education, or free public schools that would be funded or properly taxed and managed by the local government. This education reform was known as the Common School Movement. In 1837, Horace Mann put the ideas of the Common School Movement into action. Mann wanted the public education system to be rooted in good citizenship and moral education that would prepare students for society and the workforce. His crusade helped establish a public education system in Massachusetts for students of all social classes, genders, races, and ethnicities, and faiths. Soon, other states followed. The Northeast took the lead in establishing free public schools, but the South lagged behind the rest of the nation for several decades. In the early 1800s, people knew little about what caused mental illnesses or how to treat them. A mental illness is a long-term disorder, such as depression or addiction, that alters one's personality or way of thinking. Those who suffered from such ailments were often feared and misunderstood. Many mentally ill patients ended up living in prisons or poorhouses. A shocking visit to a prison inspired Lewis Dwight, a minister from Massachusetts, to help the mentally ill. While visiting inmates, Dwight recognized the need to remove people with mental illnesses from prisons and place them in hospitals called asylums. Because of Dwight's efforts, Massachusetts General Hospital opened the state's first asylum at Worcester in 1833. Dorothea Dix, a teacher from Maine, joined Dwight's cause in 1841 after witnessing mentally ill women shivering in an unheated jail cell. The authorities tried to convince her that, because they were mentally ill, the women could not feel the cold. After that visit, Dorothea toured hundreds of prisons, jails, and poorhouses. She persuaded state legislatures to develop tax-supported systems of care. Her influence helped open more asylums. At the same time, Dwight and Dorothea and others called for more improvements in the treatment of prisoners. They believed it was better to rehabilitate inmates or restore them to health instead of putting them in solitary confinement, where they were locked up with no human contact. Reformers cited tragedies from the past to make their case. For instance, in 1821, wardens of Auburn Prison in New York had placed 80 prisoners into solitary confinement for long periods of time. Some prisoners were confined for their entire sentence, which caused many to become mentally ill. In the weeks following their release, many prisoners committed suicide. Soon after, Auburn Prison eliminated solitary confinement for prisoners. The Auburn Prison's change in policies supported the reformers' insistence that solitary confinement damaged prisoners. Reformers went on to fight for prison libraries and literacy classes, programs that can still be found in prisons today. Just a quick review before we end this video. In the early 19th century, new ideas about religion inspired people to reform problems in society. Reform movements in the 1830s and 1840s led to improvements in the treatment of mental illness, the prison system, and public education. That's all for today's video.